August 6, 1945, Tokyo, Imperial General Headquarters. The morning air hung thick with humidity as Lieutenant Colonel Takeshi Arisue sat in his cramped intelligence office, reviewing overnight dispatches from field operatives across the Pacific. He believed, as did every senior member of Japanese military intelligence, that American atomic research remained years away from any practical application. Within hours, that certainty would dissolve like morning mist under a sun more terrible than any in human history. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the story of how the most sophisticated intelligence network in Asia completely missed the most significant military development of the 20th century, and how the men who had built their careers on information superiority came to understand that their confidence had been built on sand. Arisue had spent 3 years coordinating Japanese intelligence efforts regarding Allied scientific research. A graduate of the Imperial Japanese Army Academy and fluent in English, he had personally overseen the analysis of thousands of intercepted communications, defector testimonies, and espionage reports. The consensus among his team was unanimous and confident. The Americans, despite their industrial capacity, lacked the theoretical foundation and specialized facilities to weaponize atomic fission before 1947 at the earliest. Every calculation, every analysis, every source confirmed this assessment. The intelligence picture seemed remarkably clear. Japanese operatives in neutral countries had successfully cultivated relationships with European physicists who maintained contacts in the Allied scientific community. Through these channels, information flowed steadily. Reports indicated that American atomic research suffered from coordination problems, with multiple competing teams spread across various universities. The massive industrial infrastructure required for uranium enrichment or plutonium production would be impossible to hide, intelligence analysts reasoned. Aerial reconnaissance showed no evidence of facilities matching the predicted scale. In Stockholm, a Japanese diplomat named Hiroshi Oshima maintained contact with Swedish scientists who occasionally corresponded with colleagues in Britain and America. These scientists spoke freely about theoretical challenges in atomic research, discussing the extraordinary difficulties of isotope separation and the astronomical costs involved. One prominent physicist had estimated that a functional atomic device might require the electrical output of an entire nation for months of continuous operation. Such information reinforced Japanese assessments that atomic weaponry remained firmly in the realm of future possibility rather than present threat. Commander Yoshiro Fujimura, head of Naval Intelligence Technical Analysis, had compiled a comprehensive report in March of 1945 detailing why atomic weapons posed no immediate strategic concern. His analysis was mathematically rigorous and logically compelling. To produce sufficient fissionable material for even one device would require processing hundreds of tons of uranium ore, through facilities consuming thousands of megawatts of electrical power. No such facilities existed in American territory, according to reconnaissance data. The report concluded that while the United States might eventually develop atomic weapons, conventional strategic bombing and potential invasion of the home islands represented far more pressing threats. Captain Minoru Genda, an air operations specialist who had helped plan operations throughout the conflict, reviewed Fujimura's assessment with particular interest. Genda had spent considerable time analyzing American industrial capacity and respected their manufacturing capabilities enormously, yet even he found the requirements for atomic weapon production so extreme as to be practically impossible within any reasonable time frame. The precision machining, the exotic materials, the unprecedented scale of the undertaking, all pointed toward a project that would take years to reach fruition if it succeeded at all. The intelligence community's confidence extended beyond mere technical assessment. Cultural analysis suggested that American scientific efforts suffered from the democratic tendency toward committee decision-making and public accountability. How could such an enormous project proceed in complete secrecy within an open society? Japanese analysts believed their own hierarchical military culture provided advantages in maintaining operational security that democratic nations could never match. The irony of this assumption would become devastatingly apparent. On the morning of August 6th, routine monitoring stations detected unusual radio traffic from Hiroshima. Communications with the city had ceased entirely around 8:15 in the morning. This alone was not immediately alarming. American bombing raids frequently disrupted local communications. However, the pattern was unusual. Typically, air raid warnings provided advance notice, and reconnaissance aircraft would be tracked approaching the target. This time, weather reconnaissance planes had been observed, but no major bomber formation had appeared. Arisue received the first fragmentary reports around 10 o'clock. A single aircraft had been observed over Hiroshima. Witnesses reported an extraordinarily bright flash, brighter than the sun, followed by a massive explosion. Initial estimates suggested that hundreds of conventional bombs must have been dropped simultaneously. Yet no bomber stream had been detected. The reports made no sense within established frameworks of aerial warfare. Major Takanori Ito, responsible for damage assessment, attempted to piece together coherent information from contradictory field reports. Some accounts spoke of a single bomb. Others described a weapon that had ignited the entire city simultaneously. Military communications equipment, within a radius of several kilometers, had apparently been destroyed instantaneously. The thermal effects described seemed beyond anything conventional explosives could produce. Ito felt a cold sensation in his chest as he read testimonies describing buildings vaporized, shadows burned into stone, and a mushroom-shaped cloud rising higher than any witness could estimate. By early afternoon, aerial reconnaissance provided the first visual confirmation. The reconnaissance pilot, Lieutenant Toshio Nakamura, had flown combat missions for 3 years and considered himself emotionally hardened to destruction. What he observed over Hiroshima shook him profoundly. The entire city center had simply ceased to exist, not collapsed or burned, erased. A circle of total devastation extended for kilometers, with damage radiating outward, far beyond what any conceivable conventional attack could achieve. He reported that the city looked as though a small piece of the sun had touched the earth. Nakamura's photographs reached Imperial General Headquarters by evening. Senior officers gathered in stunned silence as they examined the images. The scale of destruction was incomprehensible. Every building within the central zone had been obliterated down to the foundation. The characteristic pattern of conventional bombing, damaged buildings, crater chains, surviving structures, was entirely absent. Instead, devastation spread uniformly from a central point, as though some biblical hand had simply swept away every human construction. Colonel Arisue felt his carefully constructed worldview beginning to crack. He pulled every file related to American atomic research, spreading them across his desk. The reassuring words now seemed to mock him, years away from practical application, impossible to hide the necessary infrastructure, theoretical challenges insurmountable. Every conclusion had been wrong, catastrophically, unforgivably wrong. The intelligence failure went beyond simple miscalculation. It represented a fundamental misunderstanding of American industrial capability and organizational culture. While Japanese analysts had correctly identified the theoretical challenges of atomic weapon production, they had completely underestimated American ability to solve engineering problems through brute force application of resources. What seemed theoretically impossible became practically achievable when an entire nation's industrial capacity focused on a single objective. The hidden city of Oak Ridge, Tennessee, had employed 75,000 workers at its peak, consuming more electrical power than most nations generated. The Hanford site in Washington state sprawled across nearly 600 square miles, with reactors cooled by an entire river. These facilities had operated for years in complete secrecy, their existence hidden through a combination of remote location, compartmentalization, and security procedures that Japanese analysts had considered impossible in a democratic society. The presumed advantages of hierarchical military culture proved meaningless when confronted with American organizational efficiency and industrial scale. Intelligence Officer Takashi Sakai spent the evening of August 6th reviewing decoded intercepts from previous months. Searching desperately for missed warning signs, he found them everywhere, now blindingly obvious in retrospect. References to mysterious installations in Tennessee and Washington, unusual procurement orders for exotic materials, scientific personnel disappearing from university positions, travel restrictions affecting nuclear physicists. Each clue had been noted, analyzed, and dismissed as insufficient evidence of an imminent threat. The pattern had been there all along, but cognitive bias had prevented recognition. The following morning, Arisue attended an emergency meeting of senior intelligence staff. The atmosphere was funereal. Every man in that room understood that they had failed in the most fundamental duty of any intelligence service, to provide accurate warning of existential threats. Estimates suggested that a single weapon had produced casualties equivalent to months of conventional bombing. If the Americans possessed multiple such devices, as now seemed likely, the entire strategic calculation of the conflict had transformed overnight. Commander Fujimura, whose March report had confidently dismissed the atomic threat, spoke with barely controlled emotion. His voice was steady, but his hands trembled as he held the reconnaissance photographs. The mathematical precision that had made his earlier analysis so convincing now demonstrated the magnitude of their error. Based on observed destruction radius and estimated casualties, the weapon's yield appeared equivalent to 15,000 to 20,000 tons of conventional explosives, a single bomb, delivered by a single aircraft. The implications were staggering. The discussions that day revealed how completely Japanese intelligence had misunderstood the Manhattan Project's nature. Analysts had looked for a single large facility, reasoning that centralization would be necessary for such complex work. Instead, the Americans had distributed research and production across multiple sites, each with different functions, creating redundancy and security through geographic separation. Japanese intelligence had assumed that atomic weapon development would follow the same pattern as conventional weapons programs, with gradual testing and incremental improvements. Instead, the Americans had proceeded directly from theoretical success to operational deployment. Captain Gender raised a question that haunted everyone present. If the Americans possessed one such weapon, how many more might they have? The industrial capacity demonstrated by the weapon's very existence suggested that multiple devices were not only possible, but likely. Each city in Japan now existed under a potential death sentence that could be carried out at any moment by a single aircraft that might evade all defenses. The psychological impact was as devastating as the physical destruction. By August 8th, intelligence teams had begun interviewing survivors evacuated from Hiroshima. Their testimonies painted a picture of destruction that defied comprehension. People had been vaporized instantly, leaving only shadows burned into stone. Buildings had ignited simultaneously across the entire city center. A wave of heat had preceded the blast, burning exposed skin from hundreds of meters away. Many survivors reported a strange illness setting in days after exposure: weakness, nausea, bleeding that would not stop. The weapon's effects extended beyond immediate destruction into some unknown realm of persistent harm. Lieutenant Colonel Arisu compiled a revised intelligence assessment, each word weighted with professional failure and personal shame. The document acknowledged that American atomic weapon capability had been systematically underestimated due to multiple analytical failures. The true scale of American industrial capacity had not been appreciated. The possibility of radical secrecy within an open society had been dismissed too readily. Most critically, intelligence analysis had been shaped by what analysts wanted to believe rather than what evidence suggested. The report detailed specific failures. Human intelligence sources in neutral countries had been reliable regarding theoretical challenges, but completely uninformed about engineering solutions. Signals intelligence had noted unusual activity, but analysts had lacked imagination to interpret patterns correctly. Aerial reconnaissance had been insufficient. The truly important facilities were either underground or disguised as conventional industrial plants. Each analytical method had failed not through lack of effort, but through failure of imagination. On August 9th, news reached Tokyo of a second atomic attack, this time on Nagasaki. The psychological impact exceeded even the physical destruction. One atomic weapon might be America's singular achievement, an experimental device whose production had consumed years of effort. 2 weapons, deployed within 3 days, demonstrated that the Americans possessed not just atomic capability, but atomic production capacity. The implications were impossible to ignore. If 2 weapons existed, dozens might follow, perhaps hundreds. In the intelligence section offices, officers worked through the night assembling every scrap of information that might indicate how many weapons America possessed. The analysis was grim. Based on observed production of conventional weapons, American industrial capacity could support simultaneous development of multiple atomic devices. The facilities whose scale had seemed impossible now appeared capable of continuous production. Every major Japanese city could be targeted. The home islands could be rendered uninhabitable without a single American soldier landing on Japanese soil. Major Ito, examining damage reports from both cities, noticed something that deepened the horror. The weapons used at Hiroshima and Nagasaki appeared to be different designs. One used uranium, the other plutonium, based on debris analysis and blast characteristics. The Americans had not just succeeded in creating atomic weapons, they had developed multiple pathways to production, ensuring that failure in one approach would not prevent success overall. The redundancy suggested organizational sophistication that Japanese intelligence had never imagined possible. The cultural shock extended beyond military circles. Japanese scientists who had been consulted throughout the conflict now came forward with their own failed warnings. Several physicists had tried to alert military authorities that American atomic research should be taken more seriously, but their concerns had been dismissed. The theoretical possibility had been acknowledged, but intelligence assessments of American incapability had overridden scientific caution. Now those same scientists explained in stark terms what the existence of these weapons meant for Japan's future. Professor Yoshio Nishina, a respected nuclear physicist who had advised military intelligence, attended a briefing at Imperial General Headquarters. His message was uncompromising. The weapons used against Hiroshima and Nagasaki represented merely the beginning of atomic weapon development. Future devices would be more powerful, more efficient, and easier to produce. Within years, multiple nations would possess such weapons. The entire nature of strategic conflict had transformed, and Japan's conventional military strength meant nothing in this new reality. Haresue listened to Nishina's presentation with a sense of professional vertigo. His entire career had been built on the premise that careful analysis of available information could provide strategic advantage. Now he understood that the most crucial information had been hidden beyond reach of any intelligence method his service possessed. The Americans had successfully concealed a project involving hundreds of thousands of workers and billions of dollars across multiple states for years. Every assumption about the limits of operational security in democratic societies had been wrong. The final intelligence assessment, completed on August 12th, ran to 73 pages of detailed analysis and brutal self-criticism. It acknowledged that Japanese intelligence had failed to detect, accurately assess, or provide timely warning regarding the most significant military development in modern history. The failure stemmed from multiple sources: overconfidence in analytical methods, underestimation of American capabilities, cultural assumptions that proved unfounded, and cognitive bias that shaped interpretation of ambiguous evidence. The document included a section on lessons learned that would have been valuable had they been applied earlier. Never assume that theoretical impossibility equals practical impossibility when confronting an adversary with superior resources. Never let cultural stereotypes shape strategic assessment. Never dismiss warning signs simply because they contradict established analysis. Most importantly, never confuse the absence of evidence with evidence of absence. The Americans had succeeded precisely because Japanese intelligence considered their success impossible. Commander Fujimura attached a personal note to his copy of the assessment. He wrote that the atomic attacks had not just destroyed 2 cities, but had destroyed the entire framework through which Japanese military intelligence understood modern conflict. Every calculation, every assumption, every strategic assessment now had to be re-evaluated in light of this new reality. The professional expertise that he had spent a career developing had become obsolete in an instant. In the days following the second atomic attack, as Japan moved toward acceptance of surrender terms, intelligence officers grappled with the personal dimension of their failure. They had not just missed a threat. They had confidently assured military and political leadership that no such threat existed. Decisions had been made, strategies formulated, and national policy shaped based on intelligence assessments that proved catastrophically wrong. The weight of that failure would haunt many of them for the rest of their lives. Captain Gender, in a private conversation recorded by a colleague, spoke of the psychological impact of the atomic attacks. He described how the certainty of professional analysis had evaporated in the face of undeniable reality. The reconnaissance photographs from Hiroshima and Nagasaki showed destruction on a scale that previously existed only in ancient mythology. Yet this was no act of divine wrath, but the product of human ingenuity applied to the physics of atomic structure. The most terrifying aspect was not the destruction itself, but the realization that this represented only the beginning. The intelligence failure regarding the Manhattan Project became a case study that would be examined for decades. What made the failure particularly instructive was not that Japanese intelligence missed isolated clues, but that systematic analysis led them away from correct conclusions. Every analytical tool at their disposal had been applied competently. The sources were reliable, the methods sound, the logic coherent. Yet the conclusion was completely wrong, because the underlying assumptions about what was possible proved unfounded. Lieutenant Colonel Arisu, in his post-conflict writings, reflected on the philosophical implications of the intelligence failure. He noted that certainty itself had become the enemy of accurate assessment. The confidence with which intelligence analysts had dismissed the atomic threat made them resistant to contradictory evidence. Each reassuring report had strengthened conviction that American atomic weapon development was distant and theoretical. The gradual accumulation of evidence pointing toward an imminent threat was interpreted through a framework that assumed such a threat was impossible. The organizational culture of Japanese military intelligence had contributed to the failure. Subordinates were reluctant to challenge senior assessments, even when they harbored doubts. The hierarchical structure that analysts had considered an advantage in maintaining security actually created analytical blind spots. Alternative interpretations were discouraged, dissenting views suppressed, and cognitive diversity stifled. The very organizational features considered strengths had prevented the intellectual flexibility necessary to recognize radically new threats. In contrast, the American Manhattan Project succeeded precisely because it embraced organizational approaches that Japanese analysts considered impossible. Multiple research teams pursued different approaches simultaneously. Scientists from various backgrounds and nationalities collaborated despite security concerns. Resources were allocated without requirement for immediate results or definitive proof of concept. The project succeeded through intellectual diversity, organizational flexibility, and willingness to pursue apparently impossible objectives with overwhelming resources. The human dimension of the intelligence failure added poignancy to the professional catastrophe. Many intelligence officers had devoted themselves completely to understanding American capabilities, working endless hours analyzing data, cultivating sources and refining assessments. They had been diligent, intelligent, and dedicated. Yet all their effort had produced conclusions that were not just wrong but dangerously misleading. The dedication that drove their work had been misdirected by assumptions that no amount of effort could overcome. Major Ito, examining his own role in the analytical failure, identified specific moments when different conclusions might have emerged. There had been indications in 1944 of unusual construction in remote areas of Tennessee and Washington. The scale suggested major industrial projects, but without clear military application, they had been classified as conventional manufacturing. A reassessment now revealed that the remote locations, the massive electrical infrastructure, and the extreme security all pointed toward exactly the kind of facility required for atomic weapon production. The clues had been present, but the analytical framework had prevented recognition. The speed with which Japanese intelligence had to revise its entire strategic assessment demonstrated the magnitude of the shock. Within days, the carefully constructed understanding of American capabilities that had taken years to develop was completely overturned. New assessments had to account for an adversary possessing weapons that could destroy cities without warning, delivered by aircraft that might evade all defenses. The entire concept of homeland defense became meaningless when a single aircraft could inflict damage, equivalent to months of conventional bombing. Professor Nishina, reflecting on the missed opportunities to influence policy, described the profound gap between scientific understanding and intelligence assessment. Scientists familiar with atomic physics had recognized that American atomic weapon development was not only possible, but probable given sufficient resources. However, their scientific judgments carried little weight against intelligence assessments backed by extensive field reporting and systematic analysis. The institutional authority of intelligence services had overridden scientific caution with catastrophic results. The atomic attacks also revealed how completely Japanese strategic planning had been based on flawed premises. Military planners had prepared for conventional invasion, calculating that American casualties during an assault on the home islands would be so severe that negotiated peace might become possible. The existence of atomic weapons rendered such calculations meaningless. America could impose surrender without invasion, without attrition, without risk to American forces. Every defensive preparation became irrelevant in the face of weapons that obliterated cities from altitude. In the final days before the formal surrender, intelligence officers compiled documentation of the Manhattan Project based on information that was now flowing from multiple sources. The scale of the American achievement was staggering. $2 billion invested over 4 years. Multiple facilities, employing more than 100,000 workers. Scientific collaboration involving the most brilliant physicists from multiple nations. Industrial production of materials that existed only in laboratory quantities before the conflict. The project represented the largest organized scientific and industrial undertaking in human history. Colonel Arisue, reading through the accumulated documentation, felt a profound sense of professional inadequacy. How had Japanese intelligence failed to detect an effort involving so many people, consuming so many resources, and operating for so long? The answer lay partly in successful American security procedures, but more fundamentally in Japanese analytical assumptions. Analysts had looked for evidence of what they expected to find, rather than remaining open to possibilities outside their conceptual framework. They had assumed that what seemed impossible to them would be impossible to others. The long-term implications of the intelligence failure extended beyond the immediate strategic catastrophe. The existence of atomic weapons meant that future conflicts would be shaped by capabilities that might remain hidden until first use. Traditional intelligence methods that relied on observable indicators, troop movements, industrial production, weapons testing, might be insufficient against adversaries developing revolutionary technologies in secret. The nature of strategic surprise had fundamentally changed. In private discussions, intelligence officers debated whether any realistic collection and analysis program could have detected the Manhattan Project given American security measures and Japanese resource limitations. Some argued that the failure was inevitable given the constraints under which they operated. Others insisted that critical warning signs had been available, but were dismissed due to cognitive bias and institutional rigidity. The debate itself revealed how deeply the failure had shaken their confidence in intelligence methodology. The psychological impact on individual officers varied widely. Some, like Commander Fujimura, descended into depression as they contemplated the implications of their failure. Others, like Major Ito, threw themselves into documenting lessons learned, determined that future intelligence services might avoid similar catastrophes. Captain Genda maintained his analytical focus, viewing the atomic attacks as a revolution in military affairs that required complete reassessment of strategic thinking. All shared a sense that their professional world had ended on August 6th. The formal surrender on September 2nd marked the end not just of the conflict, but of an era in intelligence practice. The officers who had devoted their careers to understanding adversary capabilities through conventional intelligence methods now recognized that revolutionary technologies could render their expertise obsolete overnight. The confidence that had characterized Japanese military intelligence before August 6th gave way to humility, born of catastrophic failure. Lieutenant Colonel Arisue, in his final report, included a section on the human cost of intelligence failure. The atomic attacks had resulted in casualties estimated at over 100,000 immediate deaths and countless more from lasting effects. While intelligence officers bore no direct responsibility for the attacks themselves, their failure to provide accurate warning meant that civilian populations had no opportunity for evacuation or shelter. The weight of that failure would remain with every officer who had contributed to the flawed assessments. The story of Japanese intelligence and the Manhattan Project became a powerful lesson in the dangers of analytical certainty. The most sophisticated intelligence organization in Asia, staffed by dedicated professionals using established methods, had reached conclusions that were completely wrong because they could not imagine that their assumptions might be fundamentally flawed. The Americans succeeded precisely because they attempted what Japanese analysts considered impossible, and succeeded at a scale that defied comprehension. In the decades following the conflict, former intelligence officers reflected on what the failure revealed about human cognition and institutional culture: the tendency to seek confirming evidence while dismissing contradictory data, the difficulty of imagining radically new possibilities when existing frameworks provide comfortable certainty, the way institutional hierarchies suppress dissenting views and discourage intellectual risk-taking. These were not uniquely Japanese failings, but universal human tendencies that any intelligence service must actively combat. The Manhattan Project intelligence failure also demonstrated how technological revolutions can render existing strategic calculations obsolete. Japanese military planning throughout the conflict had been based on careful analysis of relative strengths in conventional forces. Those calculations became meaningless when America deployed weapons that changed the fundamental nature of strategic power. Future conflicts would require intelligence services to remain alert for technological developments that might transform strategic balance without warning. The irony that Japanese intelligence failed to detect American atomic weapon development while Japanese scientists themselves pursued similar research added another dimension to the failure. The theoretical knowledge existed within Japan. Scientists understood what might be possible, yet intelligence services focused their attention on conventional military capabilities while dismissing atomic weapons as too distant a threat to warrant serious concern. The failure was not one of available knowledge, but of imagination and priority. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.